All right, continuing our conversation, it's now time to get into forensic anthropology. So, this is the application of physical or biological anthropology to the legal system. The emphasis of the study or investigation is placed on unknown human skeletal remains. This typically involves the recovery of human skeletal remains from a crime scene, the assessment of an unknown's biological profile to aid in identification, and often individuals will work with other investigators, such as a pathologist, to identify cause, manner, and time of death. Now, an individual's biological profile includes an estimation of age, sex, stature, other unique features, as well as an assessment of race. So race estimation can be done directly from skeletal remains or from genetic material analyses. Now, analysis of skeletal remains typically focus on the cranium, as if you recall, there is a long-held idea that the cranium is most resistant to change and therefore provides a good measure of genetic affiliation. Assessment usually involves a combination of metric and non-metric analyses of different cranial features, and more information will be provided on this at a later point. Now, analyses on genetic material usually focus on constructing a genetic profile of an individual, and this often relies on SNPs or VNTRs to make an assessment on the genetic relatedness to a racial population. And we've sort of talked about how these genetic markers are used in forensics for identification of individuals. So this brings us full circle back to the race debate again. So, as can be imagined, the use of race by forensic anthropologists is extremely contentious, especially in light of our conversation from the course introduction. So the resurgence of race within this subdiscipline has reawakened the long debate over the existence and utility of using race to understand human variation. So, is race real? How useful is race to understanding human variation? Now, there are numerous arguments for and against. So, arguments for the use of using race in forensics. So, there is an uncanny concordance between social races, such as the American division between black and white, and skeletal biology. In effect, the social cultural discriminatory divisions have impacted gene flow. This has prevented the two groups from becoming more similar. Now, there's also an argument for the translation of biology to the lay public. So forensic anthropologists are not attempting to explore human biological variation, but are instead interested in providing practical, usable knowledge for legal investigations. Their argument is that forensic anthropologists are tasked with translating biology into terms both law enforcement and the public understand. Race, being still widely used in folk cultures of the public, is informative and useful for identifying victims and suspects. There's also the argument that forensic anthropologists rely on the emerging concept of race, which is different from the discrete fixed categories of early race studies, and the concept that there is so much internal variation within populations to make categories meaningless. It argues that variation is along a gradient, and that groups can be separated from others, but there is still a tremendous amount of overlap between groups. Classification, then, is more of a probability instead of a determinate exact placement. There has also been discussion of the ethical prerogative of using race. So anthropology as a discipline focuses on combating ethnocentrism. This is the idea that our origin culture is better and or more correct than another culture. So our way of viewing the world is more correct than another's way of viewing the world. Now, in New Zealand, the Maori have gained significant rights in regard to the treatment and handling of ancestral remains. In order for these laws and respect to these different cultural traditions to be supported, it is necessary to identify the racial affiliation of unknown remains. To deny classification would be to impose a Western ideology about human variation upon an exploited indigenous population, which would in turn perpetuate the imperialist power dynamic. Therefore, in New Zealand, it may be ethically correct to continue to use race in forensic investigations. So now it's time to turn our attention to the arguments against the use of race in forensics. So the first and largest is the nature of human variation. So as this course has discussed on numerous occasions, biological diversity is polymorphic, meaning that within group variation is quantitatively greater than between group variation. Biological diversity is clinal, so trait variation follows gradients typically dictated by the environment including climate, culture, and biotics. Now, biological diversity, in turn, is influenced by cultural practices. So races may appear to have biological foundation, but in fact are culture-created phenomenon that have biological impacts. Now, there's also a critique of four-disc. Now, four-disc is an application that classifies unknown individuals into their most likely racial affiliation. Accuracy is dictated by the presence of a sample population in the database. So, for example, classifications, if we look at four-disc, has a large sample of African Americans who more likely have ancestry to West Africa. As such, four-disc is extremely accurate at identifying West Africans. Now, four-disc does not have a Nubian sample, and as a result, the application failed to classify them in a meaningful way. So four-disc then is only as good as its samples. The number of population samples could become exponentially large, making classification almost useless. Again, this is a result of individuals not fitting into discrete categories. Another critique of the use of race in forensics is the question of research focus. So the forensic application of race in the United States has focused on identifying individuals between white and black. The actual population of the United States is much more heterogeneous. Individuals have ancestry across the globe, and many have mixed ancestry originating from numerous geographic locales. So for example, the Middle East and North Africa form the middle gradient between Southern Africa and Europe. It would be expected that individuals from these populations would be a mosaic of traits of these two groups. Americans who have ancestry in this region would not fit into the neat European white and West African black classification dichotomy.